Frank Sinatra had spent a lifetime in control of the stage, of his image, and of every room he ever entered. He was known for confidence, perfection, and presence. But near the end of his life, something had changed. His voice had slowed, his eyes had softened, and his words carried the weight of years of silence. For more than 50 years, people had whispered about his deep friendship with Sammy Davis Jr., a man who stood beside him through fame, scandal, and a nation divided by race. When Sinatra finally spoke about that bond, what he said wasn't a confession or a defense. It was something much deeper, a truth only he and Sammy had ever truly understood. It all began in 1941, backstage at the Michigan Theater in Detroit. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, laughter, and the restless energy of performers. Frank Sinatra, just 25 years old, was already becoming a rising star as the smooth voice of the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. He wasn't yet the legend people would later call the chairman of the board, but he already carried a quiet authority that made people notice when he entered a room. That night, another act shared the stage. Small black vaudeville group called the Will Maston Trio. Among them was a 16-year-old performer named Sammy Davis Jr. He had been performing since he was 3 years old alongside his father and his uncle. There was no normal childhood for Sammy. His life was the stage, endless train rides, cheap hotels, long rehearsals, and applause that faded as quickly as it came. During intermission, Sinatra walked into the break room and noticed Sammy sitting alone, eating a sandwich. There was nothing dramatic about what happened next, no spotlight, no crowd. Sinatra simply sat down beside him and started talking. For Sammy, that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. He later said that Sinatra treated him like a man, not like a performer or a colored kid from Harlem, just a man. That distinction meant everything in 1941. America was still deeply segregated. Hotels, restaurants, and theaters had separate entrances marked colored. Most white stars wouldn't dare be seen sitting with a black performer, afraid it might ruin their careers. Sinatra didn't care. He saw a fellow artist and treated him as an equal. Sammy had admired Sinatra long before that meeting. He kept a scrapbook filled with Sinatra's pictures and newspaper clippings, proudly showing them to his grandmother. What he admired most wasn't Sinatra's fame or fortune, it was his freedom. Sinatra could walk onto any stage, speak his mind, and be accepted anywhere. For a young black performer in a country that refused him basic rights, that kind of freedom wasn't just inspiring, it was unimaginable. A few years later, Sammy was drafted into the U.S. Army, and the memory of that meeting stayed with him. Life in uniform brought him no equality. It brought humiliation. He was beaten, called slurs, and once forced to paint his face white during a comedy skit to entertain white soldiers. Yet even in that pain, Sammy found strength. He joined an entertainment unit, using singing and humor to survive. On lonely nights, he watched a short film called The House I Live In, starring Frank Sinatra. In it, Sinatra defended a young Jewish boy from bullies and spoke about an America that belonged to everyone, no matter their race or religion. For Sammy, that film felt personal, as if Sinatra was speaking directly to him. When he returned home from the army in 1945, bruised but unbroken, he made a promise to live with dignity and courage, no matter the cost. That brief meeting in Detroit had already changed the course of both their lives. One had the voice that America adored. The other had the rhythm it needed to hear. Together, they would challenge the limits of race, friendship, and loyalty in a divided world. By 1947, Frank Sinatra's fame was unstoppable. He was no longer the boy from Hoboken, he was the voice. Crowds screamed his name outside theaters, and record executives did whatever he wanted. That year, he was invited to headline at New York's famous Capitol Theater, one of the most prestigious venues in the country. When asked who he wanted as his opening act, Sinatra didn't hesitate. He said, "The Will Maston Trio." The theater managers were puzzled. Why would the biggest white star in America want a small black vaudeville act to open for him? Sinatra didn't explain himself. He simply insisted. He also demanded that the trio be paid 5 times their usual fee. The theater reluctantly agreed. That night, Sammy stepped onto the stage in front of a mostly white audience. The lights were blinding, and the silence before his first note was heavy. But within minutes, his dancing, singing, and effortless charm electrified the room. By the time he finished, the crowd was on its feet. When he walked backstage, Sinatra greeted him with a grin and said, "I told them you'd kill it." For Sammy, that moment was more than applause, was validation. A powerful white superstar had believed in him and risked his reputation to prove that talent had no color. From that day forward, their friendship began to grow. Sinatra saw in Sammy a reflection of himself, the drive, the perfectionism, the hunger to be respected. But Sammy's battle was far more difficult. Even at the height of his talent, America saw his skin color before it saw his genius. In Las Vegas, the hypocrisy was painful. Black performers like Sammy could headline at the city's grandest hotels, but when the curtain fell, they were forced to stay outside city limits in rundown motels for black guests. They couldn't dine in the same restaurants where they performed or swim in the same pools as white guests. Frank. Sinatra refused to accept this. During one tour, when management at the Sands Hotel refused to give Sammy a room, Sinatra exploded. He told them, "If he can't stay here, neither will I." He was ready to walk away from the show. The hotel panicked and gave in. Word spread fast if Sinatra was performing. Racism wasn't welcome. That single act helped begin to change the unspoken rules of Las Vegas. But even with Sinatra's loyalty, there were limits that neither of them could ignore. Sinatra was powerful, wealthy, adored by white America. Sammy, though famous, still lived in a country that treated him as less than equal. He loved Frank like a brother. But sometimes the bond reminded him that in America's racial order, friendship could only go so far. Then tragedy struck. In 1954, Sammy was driving late one night on Route 66 when he crashed head-on into another car. He survived, but his left eye was destroyed. When he woke up in the hospital, the first person he saw was Frank Sinatra. Sinatra had paid every bill, sent his personal doctor, and made sure Sammy had the best care money could buy. He even invited Sammy to recover at his home in Palm Springs. Later, Sammy said, "When I lost my eye, the first place I went was Frank's house because I had nowhere else to go." To Sinatra, helping him was instinctive. To Sammy, it meant everything. That period after the accident deepened their friendship into something like family. Sinatra became the one person Sammy could count on completely. During his recovery, Sammy struggled to find his confidence again. He had to learn to dance and sing with one eye, something few believed he could do. Sinatra never let him quit. "You're not done," he told him. "Not by a long shot." And he was right. In the years that followed, both men reached new heights. Together, they became part of the famous Rat Pack, a group that included Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. They defined an era Las Vegas music, and cool itself. They performed together, acted in films, and made the world laugh. But behind the fun and glamour, something much more important was happening. Sinatra made sure Sammy always had equal billing in their shows, something nearly unheard of for a black performer at the time. He refused to work at venues that practiced segregation and made it clear that Sammy was his equal, both on and off stage. Slowly, through Sinatra's influence and example, Las Vegas began to change. When Sammy married Swedish actress May Britt in 1960, the reaction from the public was brutal. Interracial marriage was still illegal in many parts of the United States, And even in Hollywood, it was seen as scandalous. Many of Sammy's friends distanced themselves from him. But Sinatra didn't. He stood by him publicly, defended him, and made it clear that anyone who had a problem with it had a problem with him. Their friendship lasted for decades through success, heartbreak, and controversy. They shared laughter and loyalty, arguments and reconciliation. They stood together against a world that often tried to separate them. To outsiders, their relationship was hard to define. Part friendship, part brotherhood, part family. But to each other, it was simple. They had found someone who truly understood. Near the end of Sinatra's life, when his voice had grown faint and his performances fewer, people asked him about Sammy. His answers were short but full of emotion. He didn't speak like a man remembering a colleague. He spoke like someone who had lost a part of himself. Sammy Davis Jr. had died in 1990, and Sinatra never fully recovered from that loss. Theirs was a bond that broke barriers. It wasn't about race or famille, it was about respect, loyalty, and love between two men who came from different worlds but shared the same soul. In an age when America was divided by color, they proved that brotherhood could be stronger than prejudice. And in the quiet truth of their friendship, they both found something more lasting than applause, something real, human, and unforgettable. They had seen the ugliest sides of fame, its temptations, betrayals, and loneliness. They had also faced racism, judgment, and loss. Yet, despite coming from completely different worlds, Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. found something rare and precious in each other. They didn't just share the stage. They shared the struggle. By the late 1950s, the two men were inseparable members of the famous Rat Pack, alongside Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. Together, they ruled Las Vegas. They were more than entertainers. They were a cultural force. On stage, they were charm, wit, and mischief rolled into one glittering act. They drank, joked, sang, and bantered, creating the illusion of a private party that the audience was lucky enough to witness. People adored them. They seemed untouchable, glamorous kings of nightlife, who could do no wrong. But behind the laughter and applause was another reality. Sammy Davis Jr., the only black member of the Rat Pack, carried a burden the others never had to bear. Night after night, he became the target of racial jokes, mocked for his skin color, his voice, even his size. Words like smoky, spade, and other slurs were tossed around on stage in front of thousands. The audience roared with laughter. To them, it was part of the act, just comedy. But to Sammy, it was survival. He smiled and laughed along, pretending it didn't sting. He made it look effortless, but inside, it hurt. He knew that if he showed pain or anger, it could end his career or alienate his audience. So he kept performing night after night, wearing his mask of confidence and grace. Yet after the shows ended, those jokes echoed in his mind. Outside the world of show business, civil rights activists began to criticize him. They accused him of selling out, of allowing white entertainers to humiliate him in exchange for acceptance. Some even called him an Uncle Tom, a cruel label that wounded him deeply. They couldn't see the complex reality he lived. To Sammy, playing along was not weakness. It was survival in a world that wasn't ready to accept him as an equal. Frank Sinatra, for all his flaws, always defended Sammy. When people questioned the jokes, Sinatra would say, "If you think those jokes mean I don't love him, you don't know me." He didn't apologize for the humor, it was part of the act, but he never allowed anyone outside their circle to disrespect Sammy. In public, he stood by him. In private, though, there was still a power imbalance that could not be denied. In 1959, during a radio interview, Sammy criticized Sinatra, calling him temperamental and difficult to work with. The comment, though mild, enraged Sinatra. He lashed out, using harsh language, some of it reportedly racially charged. In a fit of anger, Sinatra had Sammy removed from his upcoming film. Never So Few, and effectively blacklisted him from several major projects. For months, Sammy struggled to find work. It was Dean Martin who finally convinced Sinatra to forgive him and bring him back for Ocean's 11. The two men reconciled. But the wound never completely healed. Their friendship survived, but it changed. They learned to keep their disagreements private. On stage, they were inseparable brothers. Off stage, their relationship became more complicated, a mix of love, pride, resentment, and loyalty. By the early 1960s, America was changing. The civil rights movement was gaining strength, and both Sinatra and Davis became visible supporters. They performed at fundraisers for Martin Luther King Jr., including one at Carnegie Hall, and used their influence to pressure Las Vegas casinos to end segregation. Together, they demanded that black performers be allowed to stay in the same hotels where they performed and be paid equally. Their public alliance was powerful, but it also drew whispers. People noticed the closeness between Sinatra and Davis, the way they embraced on stage, the way Sinatra looked at him when they sang together. Their duet, Me and My Shadow, became more than a performance. It was symbolic to men from different worlds side by side, declaring their connection through song. To some, it was moving and profound. To others, it was unsettling. Rumors began to spread. Were they more than friends? In an era when masculinity and reputation ruled Hollywood, even the suggestion of something deeper could be scandalous. Tabloids hinted at it. Insiders gossiped. But neither Sinatra nor Davis ever spoke about it. Sinatra would brush off questions with a smirk, while Sammy stayed silent. To them, their bond didn't need to be explained or defended. Some said Sinatra's fierce protection of Sammy went beyond friendship. Others claimed Sammy's devotion to Sinatra bordered on worship. But in truth, their connection wasn't about romance or status. It was about survival. Two men who understood what it meant to be outsiders. Sinatra, despite his fame, was often mistrusted by Hollywood elites for his working-class roots and mob associations. Sammy, meanwhile, faced racial barriers at every step. Together, they created a space where both could be free, if only for a moment. In 1960, when John F. Kennedy ran for president, Sinatra threw his full support behind him. He organized fundraisers, performed at campaign events, and helped rally Hollywood to Kennedy's side. Sinatra wanted Sammy to perform at the inauguration, a symbol of progress and friendship. But when Sammy married Swedish actress May Britt, who was white, Kennedy's team panicked. They feared that showing a black man with a white wife at the inauguration would offend Southern voters. At the last moment, Sammy's invitation was revoked. The news devastated Sammy. He later said, "I felt like I helped build a house and was told I couldn't come inside." Sinatra was furious. He never forgave the Kennedys for the slight, though he stayed silent publicly. Privately, he comforted Sammy, telling him that politics came and went, but loyalty lasted forever. That loyalty ran deep. In 1963, when Sinatra's son, Frank Jr., was kidnapped, Sammy was one of the first people to show up at Sinatra's home to offer support. Years later, when Sammy struggled with bankruptcy and drug addiction, Sinatra returned the favor. He sent money, called in favors, and booked him for shows to help him stay afloat. But time changes everyone. By the 1970s, both men were aging and drifting apart. Sinatra grew more conservative, retreating from the activism that had once defined him. Sammy kept performing, though illness began to weaken his voice and body. They still cared deeply for each other, but their paths had diverged. In 1987, a piece of the old magic returned. The Rat Pack's Sinatra, Davis, and Dean Martin announced a reunion tour, this time with Liza Minnelli joining the lineup. The performances were nostalgic, an echo of the past. But behind the curtain, things were different. Sammy was battling throat cancer. Sinatra's health was also fading. They both knew this tour might be their last hurrah. Still, they performed with everything they had left. The laughter and music carried a deeper meaning. Nout was their way of saying goodbye. After one show, Sammy reportedly said, "We started as boys and ended as men. But we never stopped being brothers." On May 16, 1990. Sammy Davis Jr. died of throat cancer at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 64 years old. Sinatra canceled his scheduled shows and flew immediately to Los Angeles. At the funeral, he didn't sing or speak. He simply helped carry Sammy's coffin, his hands trembling as he said his final goodbye. Later, when reporters asked if he had anything to say about his friend's death, Sinatra released a brief statement. "It's hard to sum up a friendship of more than 40 years in a few words. I wish the world could have known Sammy the way I did." Those simple words silenced decades of gossip. They weren't a denial or a confession. They were a quiet truth, a confirmation that what bound the two men together was something deeper than rumor or speculation could ever explain. It was love, loyalty, and brotherhood. 8 years later, on May 14, 1998, just 2 days before the anniversary of Sammy's death, Frank Sinatra passed away. Newspapers called it coincidence, but those who knew him best said he had been fading ever since 1990. Ever since his shadow was gone, their story remains one of the most complex and beautiful friendships in entertainment history. To men, one black, one white, who defied the expectations of their time. They faced hatred, jealousy, and misunderstanding, yet their bond endured through every test. They laughed together, fought each other, and stood side by side when the world tried to tear them apart. Frank Sinatra never told the world exactly what his friendship with Sammy Davis Jr. meant. He didn't have to. It was written in every shared laugh, every performance, every word of me and my shadow. Maybe, in the end, that was his answer. Some love doesn't need to be defined. It only needs to be remembered.